fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Several shots were fired as President Kennedy's motorcade passed through downtown Dallas.
None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
Mrs. Gibson, say again, please.
Houston, we had a problem.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I have a dream. My four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Welcome to the Hagmann Daily Show, weekdays 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And now your hosts, Joe Hagmann and Jon Robberson.
Hello and welcome to this Thursday, June 7th, 2018 edition of the Hagmann Daily Show. We have a lot to get into today. John and I were just having a discussion off air about some of the things we're going to talk about today, and we're not going to cover really any news, anything of any political importance or significance, as the same stuff every day you hear on the radio. If you want to get into the political stuff, there are days for that, there are times for that, and right now we just don't feel like doing it, so we're not going to do it. And the news cycle, I mean, when you see stuff like Vladimir Putin talks World War III, and all the stuff continuing on Mueller and the Bilderberg and Google. One of the things in the news that's really interesting, Kim Kardashian is a more effective proponent of politics than somebody like Samantha Bee. I think that's pretty funny. That comment was made because of Kim Kardashian's success in being able to get the president to work on prison reform, and people were throwing out there that she's making Kim Kardashian, the person who's famous for being famous, is making other liberals look bad by being able to accomplish something. And there are a lot of funny headlines about that. So that's one thing I was paying attention to.
She's famous for the automatic bazooty. That's what she's famous for. But hey, here's a question for you, Joe. If you had to go on a long car ride, I'm thinking, why not to your favorite state? We won't even mention what that state is, but you and I both know what it is. It's south of here. If you had to go on a car ride all the way down to that state, who would you rather go on it with, Kim Kardashian or Maxine Waters?
Kim Kardashian, of course.
Which goes back to my first statement. No, but all seriousness, man, if you had to have a 10-hour conversation with somebody.
Would be Nancy Pelosi or Maxine Waters. That would be the real moral conundrum.
Okay, let's go with that one. Which one would you pick?
I don't know. Probably Pelosi, because she would be so drugged up she'd probably sleep the whole time. I don't know. They're both insane, blabbering idiots, in my opinion. So either one, it's a lose-lose situation.
Well, okay, one has to ask oneself. It's like you could almost go with Maxine Waters because you could play with her the whole time. You could goad her. You could get it. You could be like, oh, come on, Maxine Waters. What about when George W. Bush signed the Magna Carta and signed the People's Rights away during the War of 1812 and 1825? She'd be like, oh, that's right.
I was watching last night. I probably stayed up till 2, 3 in the morning watching. I watched a few documentaries last night on the history of America. I think one of them was called The Lost History of America, and it dealt with a time period from the early 1500s that saw the Spanish conquistadors and all that they had set up and done here in America. And when you look back at just a few hundred years ago, this land was unsettled, at least by what we know as the European model of colonialism. But all the different stories, John, about the conflicting powers that staked claims and lands here, and the battles that ensued, and the changes of the territories and the laws, and we have such a savage history, and it's across the world. I mean, every country has its origins in blood, but when you look how our society is so different today than it was just a few hundred years ago, it's amazing.
It is. Joe, I have mixed feelings about this, and I want to bounce it off you. And then I know we're gonna. By the way, to reiterate what Joe said for our listeners, for all the news you need to know, go somewhere else, because today we're just going to have a conversation. It's been a long week, but more importantly, the news today is just kind of silly. It's basically hundreds, if not thousands, of journalists, putting a can of soup on the stove, and that's about it. So. Looking at the bloody history of our country, when it comes to the Native American issue, okay, I've been up to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where Brother Marcus and Curtis used to join the Hagmann Report from. So I've been up there, and I also have a contingent of full-blooded Choctaw Americans in my family on my mom's side. The uncle you've heard me mention, Joe, who was the 60 cal gunner for the 7th Air Cav in Vietnam, Silas is his name. He's a full-blooded Choctaw Indian, and he married into the family, and then thus was born this whole kind of – so it's kind of cool. Like if I go to that side of the family, there are jet black hair, olive skin. I mean, they're full-blown Native Americans hanging out in their family. It's kind of cool. But anyway, with the Native American thing, I feel to this day, like in my heart, I feel badly for the disposition – that what the Canadians call the First Nation people are in to this day. I mean, their bodies weren't acclimated to drinking alcohol. When you get up into the northern Midwest, you'll see Native Americans who have drunk to the extent where their eyes have become almost kind of whitened. It's hard to explain, but it's frightening, and it's sad. And if you've ever been to a reservation, I mean, it's just absolute poverty here in America. So when it comes to the Native American thing, I look back on our rich military history, and I look at characters that we celebrate, like Andrew Jackson, the first major bulldog that stood against centralized banking. Now, then conversely,
John,
when we look at go ahead.
I just want to say that's where the two documentaries I watched. That's where the documentary ended. Is right at Andrew Jackson and a retaliation battle for the colonies of Florida. See, one of the things that I learned was this history of Florida and how Florida was different from all the other colonies, because the other colonies were British controlled. Florida was controlled by the Spanish, and they were completely different as far as their societies. The British were savage with slavery and violence, and the Spanish conquistadors at first were too, but the settlements they set up were apparently, they talk about the Underground Railroad going north, but apparently the first Underground Railroad went south to Florida. And the history of how that all went down and what happened, that's where that ended with Andrew Jackson in 1812 retaliating for the supply lines being hit by the African American and Indian militias, and the propaganda that they used not only against the Indians but against these black and Indian militias was terrible, and it was the driving force behind all this death and murder and mayhem that was brought upon it. It's really unfortunate. Just from what I never knew. You don't hear about this stuff in your history books and at school. No,
it's not mainline history. I'm glad you're tracking with this stuff, because this is fascinating stuff. There's a place down in southern Florida called Isla Tortuga, which means Turtle Island in Spanish, and it's the oldest fort.
Yeah.
It's the oldest fortification in the United States. And Joe, you just made me think of something, because this is where I was headed with my other comment. I'm going to be brief and bounce it back to you. I was going to talk about the plight of Black America and how encouraging it is. And I first learned this from Dave Barton through the Glenn Beck show back when Glenn Beck was one of us. And there were prominent Black Americans, African Americans, who fought right next to George Washington. In fact, there's reasonably good evidence that there was a man named Prince Rupert in the actual boat, in the same vessel that Washington crossed the Delaware in, which, by the way, looked nothing like what that historical painting shows. Right. It was actually a real choppy, stormy night. And then I wanted to also mention real quick. So you got you got Black America, who became the Buffalo Soldiers. They formed up entire regiments in the Civil War, and they contributed to the cohesion of our nation. And then if you jump forward, about 100 years, 80 years, you've got the famous 442nd Japanese American regiment that fought in the mountains of Italy and France. And my point was going to be, Joe, to you. Imagine being a racial minority and your parents and your grandparents and your grandparents' parents have been mistreated and in many cases maybe put on the end of a sword, but then you somehow love the land enough to suit up and actually go and fight for it. That's amazing.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Castillo de San Marcos, and it is the oldest masonry fort in the continental United States. And one of the interesting things that the documentary talked about was how this fort, because of the location in St. Augustine, Florida, in this rare stone or type of rock that was used to construct this fort, just by chance, by luck, the people who built it didn't know this, but the structure they built was fire resistant and was also resistant to impenetrable attacks by cannons. It was impenetrable. It just, unlike most concrete materials, the force of the cannonballs wasn't absorbed, by the whole structure where it shatters. It was only a very local impact, and the British could not figure out why this fort seemed indestructible. But it is over 315 years old. It's one of the oldest structures in America, and there's a rich history behind it. And I think everybody who has time should check it out, because it's an important part of the American history. And so many people are looking and trying to look into the future to see, exactly what's going to happen and how things are going to play out. But sometimes you got to look in the past, and I think taking more time to do that and understanding, how we got to where we are is just as important as to the story of where we're going.
Oh, Joe, it's critical. I'm so glad you said that, because I've often what's the proper word? Ruminated that the biggest problem in our country is that people have disregarded God and the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the biggest problem. But if we look at the right now here in front of us, it's that the average American knows so little about history. Now, you and I, and Doug Hagmann too, we're all lovers of history. And if you looked at our libraries, they're just chock full of history books. Not history books, but books written about history. Mm-hmm. And two things. The first is we cannot properly discern the times we're in if you don't understand where all the generations that came before us went. That's number one. Number two, it sounds like you've got a pretty good reference piece up in front of you right now about the fort down in Florida. And if I'm dragging deep into my memory here, but isn't it the impenetrability, isn't it because they made the actual mason works with coral dust?
It was, yeah, it's some kind of rare stone. And let me see what I'm looking at. There was a page on St. Augustine from the actual city, but it is, let me see. Okay, it is 320 acres. It was built in 1672, and I got to find the name of it. But it was built with some special stone that was different from other stones, and they put it together, apparently, unknowing to them. The way that they did it made the fort impenetrable, and the British could not figure out, what to and how to overtake it, as the whole town, when the first English or British attack happened, they brought at St. Augustine everybody in the town into this fort, over 1,500 people, and they apparently they had very old weaponry, but because they were able, the first deaths occurred also by themselves. One of their cannons misfired because it was so old, they hadn't used it in such a long time, but they were able to fend off the British for decades at this fort, at this main fort, and all because of the way it was built and the type of stone that it was used to build it. And I think that's pretty neat little piece of history when you think about the chance how that comes together. The Coquina was different at the absorbing impact of shells. The siege was broken when the Spanish fleet from Havana arrived, trapping some English vessels in the bay. And I can't find I got to do a more specific search to see what the name of the stone is, John. But it's very interesting.
Coquina? Did you just say the word coquina?
Yeah.
I think that means like coral concrete in Spanish, but I'm not sure.
Spanish for small shells was
Okay, there we go.
The Castillo is a masonry star fort made of stone called coquina. It is Spanish for small shells, which consist of ancient shells that have bonded together to form sedimentary rock, similar to limestone. And it's one of the strongest structures, in our history. And you can still see, apparently, all the cannonball impacts and where there's holes in the wall and whatnot.
You know what would be rad is if we could do the Hagmann Report, like on Jeopardy or on, I don't think they have Family Feud up. I know they tried to revise it a few years ago, but Joe, it's a little before your day, but Family Feud was like a huge game show where you guess things based on surveys. Right. I think we could go in and probably rock the house pretty good to Hagmann Report, Either that or we'd go in and get smoked in the first round, one of the two.
No, but it's again the rich history. Everybody should go check those documentaries on the early time of America, because there's so much to be learned there. But one of the other things we wanted to talk about today, John, and that is the NASA announcement. NASA is set to make an announcement on something that they found on Mars. And there are a few other stories out there, USA Today, Fox News. NASA is set to make a major announcement about a Mars discovery Thursday. In a statement released earlier this week, the space agency promised new science results from its Mars Curiosity rover. News of an announcement has sent ripples of excitement throughout the scientific community. Now, we've seen these type of announcements and hype given to these things before. Who knows what they're going to... I think it's irrelevant. What they're going to announce that there's some microbial type of life where water once existed or still is on Mars. If that's the case, I mean, that's nothing... That's nothing groundbreaking. And I don't know. Who knows what they're going to say. But many people believe that the Mars Curiosity rover isn't even on Mars. I don't know how many people have done research into some of the theories, but apparently there are, I guess, mimic rovers on Greenland, which has the same landscape as Mars. And many people believe that the government is faking the Mars rover footage with this fake excavation in Greenland. John, have you saw this or heard about this?
I have. Well, the two things come to mind, Joe. The first is real quick with the Mars thing. Many of our listeners will remember about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there was what was the first Martian land rover called?
I don't know. I don't remember.
Because there was Spirit and there was Observation and there was one other one, and I think Spirit and Observation are the two more recent ones. But Joe, you'll probably remember this because you love astronomy and planetary stuff. But remember the discovery of quote unquote blueberries on Mars?
No.
Okay, so long story short, I went to dailymail.co.uk just now, and I saw a documentary on PBS years ago about this, but it's fascinating. They brought so one of the rovers shot back these color photo images that are like amazing. Like they look like Steve Quayle's photography or Jackie's photography. Like they just look like somebody got a killer digital camera and went and popped it in their front yard. I mean, the clarity is amazing. But there's all these little tiny blue, well, they call them blueberries, but they're about the size of a marble, and there's thousands of them scattered across these amazing red rocks that look like some kind of Gobi desert or something. And what they think the blueberries are, this almost kind of in a weird way ties into the coquina cement of the fort we were just talking about on a molecular level. These little blueberries, a lot of scientists think that they are indicative of water having one time been on Mars. And that kind of goes back full circle, Joe, to what you were just saying. I'll hold my other thought for after you.
Well, I don't know what to expect, if anything, from this announcement. And, many people find I love watching the night sky, as I've said, and we've talked about many times. It's a habit of mine. And the universe is it's amazing when you think about the way God created everything, and how, basically the earth just hangs in this vast outer space system of stars and galaxies, and who knows what's out there? Who knows what else God created? We do know one thing, that there is only two forces that influence us in this world. One is evil and one is good. There are only two parties you got to pick a side. But anyway,
Wait, hold on. I want to comment quickly on that. You bailed me out one night back in October of 2015 on the Hagmann Report because your dad threw me a real humdinger question, and he asked me about, of all things, anti-Semitism in the film industry, and I didn't. I got caught flat-footed. I had some raw thoughts on it, but I couldn't really process them. And you jumped in, Joe. I don't know if you remember this, but you saved me for sure. You said, "Look, at the end of the day, there's only everything we do. Forget about Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, black, white. There's only one division in everything we do, Joe, and that is, as you were just saying."
Yeah, the spiritual division. And it is, so regardless of, when we talk a lot about the deceptions, excuse me, all what the satanic agenda, the forces of darkness that Ephesians talk about, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And we know that the earth is basically a stage that is used to carry out the satanic agenda as well as to fulfill God's will. And we, as man, fallen into sin, have become corrupted since the Garden of Eden. And now you have this battle, but the battle is for the souls of man. And I guess when we talk about all that, people seem so consumed with what's out in outer space, what the potential they could find, and it's all in a quest to try to disprove God. So some of this stuff that you see from NASA and some of these announcements, you have this group. It's a New Age religion. It's the alien type belief system. But my point is, if aliens came down from outer space tomorrow, is that going to change your belief in Jesus? It's not going to change mine. So that's, I guess, what my whole point is.
Well, that ties in interestingly to a couple of the guests we have coming up tonight on the Hagmann Report, and we could definitely, Joe, make a note of this and bounce this off of them. And I'm thinking specifically of in hour 2 we have Josh Peck. You can't ask for a better go-to on a question like that. And then we actually have a guest who's been on twice before, once with Stephen Menking and once solo, but it's been about a year since he's been with us, and that's Chris Balcom, who is he's kind of like a Josh Peck type guy. He's always investigating kind of the mysteries, if you will. And I think that's a question that we could totally unpack a little bit with them. And before I forget, let me ask you this. To get your telescope back up and running, we need to have like a little weekend project, right? Don't we need to build something?
Yeah, we need to put together some type of frame to hold the. Okay, so basically we have it's an 8-inch circumference circle, and it's about 4 foot tall, and that is it needs to go both vertically, up and down. It needs to be able to move up and down and left and right. So we got to figure out some kind of, Eric, I'm sure, can put together, or you can put together a very simple design with a few pieces of wood and some screws that we could fashion to get that, to get the telescope mounted again. That's what needs to happen.
What we could do is we could build, if we wanted to just go really rough style so we could get the telescope back up and running, so that it tilts up and down, we could just put it on a simple hinge, a simple lever type thing.
Yeah.
Then so it rotates. If we really wanted to go down and dirty, we could just go over to Walmart and buy a Lazy Susan and bolt the thing onto a tripod. So it would be a Lazy Susan. It'd be a tripod that we build out of 2x4s with a Lazy Susan on top, and then we would build almost like you were talking about the old Canons a minute ago, almost like a Canon caisson with a hinge. And then we would have to use some kind of clamping mechanism to hold the actual telescope. Yeah, that'd be a fun project. We should get Tech Eric in on that as well, because between he and I, he might what I'm dreaming up looks kind of Fred Flintstone-ish. Tech Eric might be able to put something better together.
The telescope it used to have a mount, so there was already holes drilled into the actual cylinder that can be used to again. So there's already, it's not something that we have to, the holes are already drilled, everything's there. We just need to fashion something that will hold that and make it move properly. But yeah, I've always been thinking that it might be time to start saving up some money to buy a new telescope. I can't imagine that maybe a few $100 you could get something similar to what I have now, and something newer, because this is a very old telescope I got, and I have been looking for the pieces like the magnifiers, the different lenses and whatnot, and I found them, but I don't know how. I don't know. I guess I'm now debating whether I should just get a new one and give up on this one, because it seems that putting this one back together is a huge task, and I don't know.
It'd be a fun project.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll
you know
see.
what's funny is Jackie Hagmann, for our listeners, she was telling me a couple months ago that the thing she wants the most is a telescope. So I don't know if that's something you and she did when you were kids or what, but it seems to run in the family.
Well, yeah, I don't know. No, that's not anything I've ever talked about with her. But anyway, you know, the fascination with the outer space, it's just I don't know. Some nights when you just look out in the stars, it's you know, it just makes you think about things in a different perspective from the daily grind. You know, how we think about things from moment to moment as we go about our day. But it's fascinating. So I'm looking forward to what NASA will be coming out with here in just a few hours. And I'm sure if you go on YouTube, I'm sure NASA's live stream at 2:00 will be on. So we'll know what they're going to say in just a few hours here. So, and I don't know, you know, I don't think it's really going to impact it. No matter what they say, it's not like they're going to come out and say, "Oh yeah, we found aliens or intelligent life," or it's going to be some, you know.
And if it did, I'll tell you what, it would all of a sudden knock the IG's report back to page 2, I imagine. But let me ask you a question. I think I already know the answer to this, but you mentioned a moment ago that there are people who believe that the Mars rovers are maybe even parked in Greenland.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking about the flat Earth thing and about all these people who don't believe we went to the moon. I personally do believe we went to the moon. But Joe, let me ask you, number one, do you believe we went to the moon? And number two, do you personally feel, based on the gematria and the sort of bizarre history that people like dark journalists cover, do you believe that NASA is occultic in its roots?
Absolutely. Well, look who started it. It was the Nazis that came over here from Project Bluebeam. You know, the Vril Society and these occultist, genocidal maniacs were the ones who started NASA. Of course it's evil.
It's a good point. I think, now hold on a second. I think Paperclip is what brought the Nazis over.
Yeah, what I say? Bluebeam was the UFO.
That's the ufology thing.
Yeah.
Tell us about Bluebeam, Joe.
Well, Operation Bluebeam was a government operation that documented UFO sightings, I believe, from the 1970s through the 1990s, and it was this compilation of all these incredible encounters that people had, and the military would track this, and they called it Operation Bluebeam. And maybe it's a little bit different in the years and parameters that I just said, but it's an interesting piece of history in itself. You listen to some of those stories, but we see this huge increase, and that's one of the things that Bluebeam showed, that over the years, that more and more and more reports were becoming more and more frequent of all these things being seen in the sky. And I believe, you know, there are the forces of good, there are the forces of evil, and those are the only two things other than man-made, unknown technology, which many people say that there's actually, you know, civilized colonies of humans that live out in space, and have, you know, these anti-grav. I don't know. We really don't know. Two things: what Antarctica has to do with space and this Earth, and what
let's go there
level
next.
of human technology we actually have, and have we already weaponized space? That's what we don't know.
Wow, those are good questions. First of all, about a year ago, I got in one day. You know how you poke around online and you go down little rabbit trails that you weren't planning on?
Oh yeah, all the time.
I wound up on a site that shows all of the military insignia. So, you know, for our non-veteran listeners, every branch of every service of the military, every division, regiment, and so forth,
right,
they have insignia like Old Ironsides or the 7th Air Cav or the 82nd Airborne or whatever. Joe, if you look at military, I would encourage all of our listeners, go do a search for military insignia, and what is that? ISIGNA. And Joe, they are all like the Office of Naval Intelligence. So many of them are like pyramids, the Luciferian eye. I mean, it's replete with occultic symbolism once you have a little bit of understanding of symbology. And I didn't even hardly know this until a couple of years ago, but we have a full-blown Space Command that's under the U.S. Air Force. So I can't imagine that we would have a space command if we have not, in fact, weaponized space. And then that ties into something else I want to bounce off you back quickly to Project Bluebeam. Joe, has it come across your radar in the years that you've been doing this? There was an incident, and I think it was in like the mid-1950s off the coast of Cuba, where the U.S. Navy was playing around with like laser technology and holographic technology back then, and they freaked out the residents of Havana, making them think that there was kind of a Mars attacks thing going on. So 2 questions: weaponized space, and does that Cuban incident ring a bell?
Whoops, I was muted. No, the Cuban incident, I don't. I have no idea if about that history. And what I'm looking at now, the Air Force Space Command website, as you said, John, just the insignia alone is pretty interesting. But have we weaponized space? From my own observations, what I can deduce from what I've witnessed in the sky, there's a lot of space junk. There's a lot of satellites. There's a lot of unknown objects up there, but there seems to be a distinction between 2 types of things I see in the sky. One is an object looking like a star, moving in a straight line from one point to another, not stopping, not varying of speeds or blinking in its lights. And then there's the other kind that seem to maneuver differently, move around, blink or not blink. And I don't know what these things are, but there's definitely technology. There's definitely, whether it's demons or humans and demons working together. We are told in Scripture that Satan has plotted to do a number of things. I will ascend above the clouds into the sides of the north. I will sit as God in the thrones of the north. On and on and on. When we know that he will present this great deception, and he has had 6,000 years to plan this thing out, and the deception will be so great that even if it were possible, the elect would be deceived. Now, what could bring the elect? What could bring the most what am I trying to say here? The most devout believers in Jesus Christ. What could bring them to doubt their faith?
Well, okay, first of all, now I know I can tell just by your voice, you've got some ideas of some answers to that, but I'll just kind of toss this one in there that the first thing I think, Joe, would be the lack of having been sealed by the Holy Spirit after a true repentance moment. So I know we're told in Matthew, and I think it's in all the Gospels, but I know it's in Matthew, that when, because this kind of goes into the whole like Katy Perry, Bob Dylan question, how could they be saved and then revert, etc. Well, when you are truly redeemed, when you come broken to the foot of the cross and you say, look, Jesus, I cannot do this. I'm a sinner. I'm a wreck. Come in and cover me with your blood. You're sealed by the Holy Spirit. Like when Jesus told his disciples, look, I have to leave you soon so that I can be with you forever. That's what he was talking about, that infusion of his Holy Spirit that protects us, it guides us, and it, by the way, it also is what puts guilt in us when we're doing something wrong. So that would be my first answer, but Joe, I'll give it back to you.
Well, again, we have to ask the question, what would make a true believer in Jesus stop that belief? What could be such a great deception? And we know that Satan is the counterfeit. He always tries to counterfeit what the Lord has done, whether it's his making people attempt to worship him, creating his own species of hybrids, whatever it is. He's been rebelling against God since the beginning, and we know that he is transformed. He transforms himself into an angel of light. And there's an old book called Modern Spiritualism from like the 1800s that says many who profess to be religious and faith in God and Christ and Bible in the way have done so to adapt itself to the religious world. When Satan fails to persuade all who remain in open unbelief, he transforms himself into an angel of light and professes to believe the truth himself. He does it openly, only to deceive. While professing to believe the truth, he perverts the truth so that men receive error as truth, and thus he accomplishes his purpose only in another way. For truth perverted is more deceptive and dangerous thing, and a far more difficult thing to deal with than open unbelief.
Wow.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But
What was the book again, Joe?
Modern Spiritualism, and
By
that's
who?
from page 58 and 59. I don't know here. W.A. Clockord, Colcord.
Huh. Okay. A couple things. First of all, when we do the rebrand, what would be a lot of fun is on our landing page, or because what we're going to do, listeners, we're not going to let it all out right now. But one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to make this show easier for you to find. So we've received so many people who've checked in the 11 months we've been doing this, and sometimes they can find us on BTR, sometimes for whatever reason they can't. We're also on Global Star Radio Channel 3, and then we post what we feel are particularly important shows up on YouTube as well. We're going to have our own independent landing page because we're actually going to have our own independent website. And what would be fun, Joe, is we should do like a little corner that's John and Joe's libraries. And because you and I mention books almost every day, but we never, I think we use care in selecting what books we share with the listeners. And again, if our listeners begin, and then what's cool about a lot of the books Joe and I read, and Joe, I know this was a hobby of yours and remains so to this day. A lot of these books, you can get them for like $1 on eBay, or you can go down to your local used bookstore and get them for like $1 or $2. And Joe, I know you've built like an enormous library that way.
Oh yeah, when we used to do the private investigation work and travel all over New York State, we'd always stop at used bookstores, and some of the best books I've ever read I've gotten at these places for $1, $2, $3. I mean, the volumes of George Washington, I got that for like $5, and these are from the 1800s basically. Now I've basically destroyed them. From reading them so much, but
yeah, you have. That book you had last night when we had Gon Shamiro on. I don't know if I can describe this, folks, but imagine like your great granddaddy's Bible that he took with him to World War I and then like took it on the Grapes of Wrath road from Oklahoma to California.
It is pretty beat up. That's that Brzezinski book, the Totalitarianism, Autocracy, and I got it right here. I'm glad you mentioned that, John. I've found so many things fascinating you know what? I left it at the studio. In that book, it talks about the totalitarian ideology, whether socialism or fascism or communist. It didn't matter. It's this idea of this force of government and how it takes over a society. And that book is like a playbook of what has happened in this country and how we've become so corrupted and upside down. And it's from the 1950s, and that's why it's gotten so much use, because literally you can see a blueprint of these people's plans of how to infiltrate and how to corrupt and disrupt the natural flow of society for their progressive ideology. And it's all the same, whether it is the monarchies to the communist. I mean, even democracy, even populism is all used as a weapon against the people. Everything is a conspiracy to keep us oppressed. It really is. From the monetary system. I mean, when I was reading, I think it's Aristotle's Constitution of Athenia, and if you read on part 6 of that document, it talks about Solon, the famous ruler from Greece. It talked about one of the first things he did was change the monetary system from a debt-based economy, instantly freeing this whole society of people. And we have found ourselves back under that yoke of economic bondage again. And it's really unfortunate. But all governments are only used as a tool of control and manipulation to further this agenda. Even if it was, the documentaries we were talking about, what the Catholic Church, the violence the Catholic Church has committed in the name of spreading the gospel, it just baffles my mind when you hear about it and read the stories, and it's crazy.
It's baffling, Joe. You just drew a couple of great points together. Now, 2 or 3 days ago, when we were talking about Robert Kennedy, you mentioned I think I agree with you, probably the most. President Kennedy had Pierre Salinger and one other guy who's right on the tip of my tongue. I've read his book, who were his speechwriters, and they were brilliant at turns of phrase, like ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And all of his speeches have a ton of those in them. But his best speech, in my opinion, is the one where he quotes the Grecian ruler that you just quoted from Aristotle's dialogues about the monetary system. And what Kennedy said about him was that he also said, and his name is like Sola, right? Isn't that his name?
Solon,
Sola
yeah.
or Sola? Solon. And he said that every citizen essentially has a duty to their fellow citizens to do the following things. And one of them was to expose evil and corruption at every turn. And Joe, the reason I like that Kennedy speech is because, in my opinion, when you look at history, in 1962, the day before he left the White House, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who interestingly was one of our oldest presidents to date at that time, he was in his early 70s, before his departure from the White House, one day before, he made the famous military-industrial complex speech. But that speech was originally the congressional military-industrial complex, and he was advised to remove congressional from that speech. And you can actually see the handwritten documents if you do a search. Kennedy came in, who was the youngest president to date at that time. So it was a passing of the torch from the 1880s and 90s generation to the having fought in World War II generation, right? And then Kennedy famously made what we call the secret society speech. Again, going back to Solon, he quotes him in there. And what the outgoing president warned us of and what the incoming president warned us of, when you combine the two, congressional military industrial complex with the secret societies where, as Kennedy said, they're buried rather than exposed. They're covered up rather than made public. When you combine those two, Joe, you get the wicked brew that we're drowning in today.
No, that's very well said, John, and it's very true. The true positions of power and influence in our society are all wrapped and intertwined with this. We call them secret societies, but really it's the religion of the occult, the satanic religion. And that's at the bottom line what it is in there. It's used to control. I mean, how do you think this whole world is being controlled and is so meticulously thought out? Everything is an institution to basically enslave people. And we have a much more freedom-centric type of slavery, if that is even applicable. Maybe the word slavery isn't.
No, it makes sense. What you're saying is we have the type of slavery that people are clamoring for, and they're spending their hard-earned money on it, not just through their tax dollars on one side of the door, but with their own discretionary income on the other side. Your tax dollars are paying to build the surveillance grid, and your dollars you spend at Best Buy are paying for the hardware that you need to make the surveillance grid function. Yeah,
that will ultimately be used against us, in the very end when we see this, when the tribulation. So we're basically, in every respect, paying for our own deaths, and the only way around that, either you're going to, you should die fighting to take back the power that we have given up, or you're going to die as a result of not fighting back. That's the way I look at it, and I'm not telling anybody to go fight or anything, but there's only two ways to. There's no other option. I mean, that's just the way it is, and that's just the truth of the matter. So from there, people have to decide what they want to do and how they want to fight. Whether it's a radio show, whether it's documentary filmmaking, or standing on the street corner being a street preacher. However that looks, I don't know, but.
Well, just having the guts to retweet as opposed to hit the like button. The like button, I mean, that's nice, but the retweet is what makes Twitter powerful. And when people, and this happens a lot nowadays, Joe, when let's say we I'll put out the piece by Sawman the other night about this horror show down in Tucson, and we don't need to go there today, but I'm just using this as an example. A tweet about that will get like 18 retweets and 67 likes. And what that tells me is 49 people agree, but they don't want to lose their Twitter account, so they don't spread the word to their account, which means that guess what? At that very moment, just on something as whimsical and stupid as Twitter, at that very moment, the bad guys win, the good guys lose because of the cowardice of people who simply, they're telling you, well, I agree, but I gotta kind of hang back here in the backcourt. And Joe, it got me thinking. I want to run something that two different guests on Hagmann Report said to your dad, Doug Hagmann, and yourself. One was way before my tenure with the company, and the other one was last year. So we'll start with Nathan Leal. So he used to drive me up a wall and back down again. And this is before I actually met the man and so forth. But anyway, he used to say, all the patriots out there, all the people who are oiling their AR-15s and getting the 9mm ready to rock and roll, you're going to fight for the Constitution. But what happens if in that fight you're one of the people that catches a round or two, and when you face the Lord Jesus Christ, if he were to say to you, you were willing to fight for a 200 and some odd year old document, but you weren't willing to go to the mat or go to the death for the inerrant word of our Heavenly Father that we gave you as an instruction manual. You were willing to die for the U.S. Constitution, but not for the Holy Bible. That's quote number one, Joe, and I'm going to bounce both of these off you. The other one was Steve Moshny, who came to us thanks to Ocaso Media. And Joe, he was a former Muslim who had converted to Christianity, and we've only had him on once, Steve Moshny, and he did something incredible that night. Again, it irritated me, but it irritated me because he was right, just like Nathan was when he used to make that admonishment. And Steve said, love your neighbor as yourself, as you would yourself. That's the golden rule. That's the Sermon on the Mount. Love your neighbor as yourself. I'm challenging all Christians out there to love your Islamic neighbor as yourself. And I almost had a meltdown when I heard him say that, but Joe, it was because I felt convicted. Back to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, when we talk about things on this show, our opposition to, illegal immigration, it's not a personal thing against any one person. Are you going to hate somebody because they have a different faith than you? No, that's exactly the opposite of what our faith teaches. But at the same time, we don't have to, we can push back against the evil ideas and promotions. But on an individual level, you're always supposed to treat people with respect and as a human being, regardless of the differences between each other. And that's one thing that's, really absent and has been always absent from our society. When you look at history, it's amazing how much worse it was just a few hundred years ago. But either way, it's a fascinating time that we live in, and I'm going to look more into that military insignia, John. I really haven't studied stuff like that, but I will check some of that stuff out because symbology was the first language.
Pull it up right now. Just type it into Google and pull it up right now.
I got it up here. Symbology is so important when we talk about the occult secret society, people that gather and conspire. Symbology is one of it is the main language among these people. And we also know that it is employed by the pedophiles as well. When you see the stuff from the Pizzagate, the FBI's codes on what child pedophiles use as codes to other pedophiles to indicate to them that they're the same. It's all symbols, and this is how the world of the secret occult works and the powers of darkness. It's all sealed and veiled in mystery. And that has to be exposed, and we're told that it will be exposed in its time. And I think people are going to be surprised at the level of control. I don't think anything's overlooked as far as any organization, any institution that has authority over any sector in the public. It all is basically goes back to that wide path of destruction type mentality and darkness behind it.
Nice catch. Joe, we've got about 10 and a half minutes left. We've had such a remarkable time. Now, for our listeners who have been busy or haven't checked in yet this week, Joe and I have been co-hosting the evening show together. And when we wrap it up with Dr. Ted and Austin tomorrow, it'll be a full 5-night run. Of the guests that we've had on so far this week, and my goodness, it's been such a wonderful time. We've had on Ashton Birdie, Carl Alfred, Peter Barry Chalka, Stephen Minking, Stan Deo, plus his guests with the whole Africa expose. Last night, Gans Shimura, Alicia Powell covering the political waterfront, Jonathan Hollerman talking about preps, the former Air Force SEER instructor, and then we had the spiritual context with Pastor Casper McLeod. Joe, of all the stuff we've covered on the evening show this week, what are some of the things that have really touched you or got your mind gears spinning?
Well, really, as the Gons interview, I've been really focused and paying attention to stuff on his YouTube channel over the last few weeks, The Face Like the Sun, and that's really interesting. But, I'm just going to come out with it and say this. I want to talk about this, John. I've been having this reoccurring nightmare for years now, and it's very common, right? But last night there was a difference.
I asked you about. Hold on a second. I'm sorry. I asked you about what's got your mind gears spinning.
I keep thinking about this nightmare, John.
This reoccurring nightmare. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Apparently, I have to say something about it because every time I'm trying to think about something else, I get these images of this nightmare popping back into my mind. But it's a reoccurring nightmare that I have all the time, and it has only slight variations. But last night it had a very interesting change, and it goes like this. I guess if I'm going to summarize it real quickly, this is how it would be. So you're dreaming. You don't know you're dreaming, yeah, and life is normal. You're in some situation, some familiar place, whether it's your childhood home or your parents' house or whatever. You're in a kind of familiar location. At some point, something goes wrong. We never know I never know what goes wrong or where it goes wrong, but it turns into normalcy to being hunted to be thrown in jail or killed, and it always happens where at some point it comes to violence, and I either get killed or I win. Last night I got killed, and it was just crazy because usually it's men, but last night it was a woman in my dream that killed me. Wow, it's just crazy. I don't know why I have this reoccurring dream, but every time, I don't know, once a week, once every few weeks, boom, stone cold in the middle of the night, I'll wake up in a sweat, and I'll have to, smoke a cigarette and, get a glass of water and stay up. It's just something that happens, and I don't know, I never talk about it, but it was just interesting because last night, there was a variation in the dream. And it left me kind of,
Were you in the dream? Okay, so first of all, I've had dreams like that too, for sure, and I bet a lot of our listeners have. In the dream, were you did you ever have that a component of it where you're trying to kind of escape, or you're moving down hallways and through corridors and up and down stairs, maybe up and down ladders? Was there any kind of component like that in it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you can't. For a long time I had dreams where you couldn't move. You're so slow. If you had to try to run away, you couldn't get away. If you had to shoot a gun, the bullets would fall. The gun would or they're the wrong caliber. They don't fit in the gun. Yeah. Any and everything in between. But that kind of, I don't have dreams like that anymore. But one of the things that I do have in my dreams now is the sense whatever goes wrong in my dreams, to where it goes from being normal to where I'm being hunted or attempted to be murdered. It's this, like, something happens where you just get this feeling of dread and panic. It's like a feeling that you only get in your dreams. I mean, it's indescribable to anything I've really felt in real life. But it's terrible, and I don't know what it is about those dreams, but man, they some nights it's rough, and I don't know what obviously there's a meaning behind it in my own subconscious, but who knows? It's just something that everybody has nightmares, and I wonder how many people have reoccurring nightmares. I'm sure there's a lot.
I bet a lot, and I've been interested. It's always anecdotal, because you say, well, we have a pretty good feeling of our audience, but it's because God blesses us with the resources and the capability to get out to conferences and meet people. And that's really, folks, the main reason that we go to conferences. It's not about marketing or publicity, because frankly, when more often than not, the vast majority of the people who attend these events are already, and praise God, they're already familiar with the Hagmann Report. We go, whether it's getting on planes or packing up the vehicles, we go because it's important to us to meet as many of you as possible, and it's an enormous blessing. Sometimes it's kind of hard because it's overwhelming, but it's a huge blessing. And Joe, I know these are hard shows to do. I should probably ask you this offline, but I'm just going to do it right now anyway. The way that I came to become acquainted with Doug and Joe, and it's kind of funny because we quote unquote knew each other for about a year and a half before we met in Bozeman, Montana back in 2014, but you one night, I think L.A. Marzulli was the guest. It was like early 2013 or maybe late 2012 on the Hagmann Report, back in the early days. It was L.A. Marzulli's first time on the show. Let's put it that way. So, and Joe, I think it was you who had the idea that you guys should do a dream segment on the program. So you and your dad encourage people to call in. And that's the first time I ever talked to you guys. And I won't go into the dream, but Joe, could we do that on the Daily Show? If people email us and they put dream in the subject line, we could do a show where, as long as they give us their Skype, it's audio only, so all you got to have is Skype. But we could bring on maybe 4 to 6 people, maybe 6-7 people that could take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and tell us about their dream.
Absolutely, we could do that. And I guess the best email to do that is you can send it to Joe at Hagmann Report. You can send it to studio at hagmanandhagmann.com, or you can send it to John. John, what's the best email you're using now?
Absolutely. The best email is Jon, Jon, at hagmanreport.com. And by the way, Joe, I know we're running out of time. I'm going to make this my final comment and give it to you to take us out. Is anyone else out there having a problem? And please work with me, folks. I mean, we all have problems with email from time to time, but I just talked to Pastor Mike Spalding yesterday. I know Jim Hoft at the Gateway Pundit, as well as some of his team, definitely at Hagmann Report with me, with my old email account, the Gmail account. There's something going on with people's email accounts right now, and there's too many people, all the way from Pastor Mike Spalding all the way over to Jim Hoft, the editor-in-chief and founder of Gateway Pundit. It's too broad a swatch of people for there not to be something going on. It's just too much. It can't be coincidental. So if anybody's having a weird email thing where you're getting a spam score, or you're having some trouble, especially if you're part of the new media, please contact me, because this is very confusing and we're trying to figure it out. Lastly, if you want to hear from Steve Quayle, Lisa Haven, Tracy Beans, Craig Sawyer, Doug Hagmann, and many others, go to hagmanreport.com and just type in on the search bar Tech Tyrants, and that will take you to the last piece I wrote. Tech Tyrants collude with Department of Homeland Security. Media influencers are on the list, or media influencers are the target, I believe. Joe, back to you for the remainder of our time.
Yeah, the dream thing's a great idea, John. I think one of the things that when we are going to go through this rebranding phase, we are going to also change, how we conduct the show, and it's going to be more like shows that we do today. Because I got to say, I don't know what it is about doing the radio, but some days it's like I don't want to say a chore, but you're not like in the mood to come on and share your feelings and whatnot. And it's like a default mechanism to go and read headlines and analyze headlines. But I'd much rather, on a daily basis, do a show like we are doing today, talking about the things we were talking about today, than to do a show based on, just news events, more than half of which are just propaganda. Anyway, so, and as I said yesterday, how many news headlines that we cover over the last 7 years can you actually remember or had an impact or importance on your life? Not many.
Or do anything about,
right?
Look, what we want to do, I'm sorry, I know I said it was going to be my final comment, but that's classic Jon Robberson. What we want to do, listeners, and by the way, hit us up. We want to hear from you guys, man. We want to get more emails from the Hagmann Daily Show. We get an enormous amount for the evening show, but we want our listeners to contact. This is a great opportunity to get to know Joe and I, because we're not getting so many that we can't reply to them. Joe, I replied to that email that you forwarded to me yesterday, and I hope to hear back from the gentleman. But when we rebrand, this is going to be a lot more interactive and participatory. Tell us what you're interested in. What topics do you want to hear more on? And frankly, what topics are you tired of? Because Joe and I want to be here to serve you folks. And we really remember, Joe, when we first talked about this a year and a half ago, we wanted to do this to keep people company and to keep their spirits up, and to break down any walls between the Hagmann Report brand and all of our audience, because there is no wall. We're all just God's children, man.
Absolutely right. We are out of time, and it was a great show, and we will pick up on this discussion tomorrow. And you can support us by supporting our sponsor, simplycleanfoods.net, using promo code Hagmann, or also there is a PayPal link that I will put in the blog talk description. That's paypal.me/Joe Hagmann. Any and all contributions are welcome, and we thank you so much for listening and your support. Send us those stories about your nightmares or your dreams, even if they're not nightmares, if you find them interesting enough to do so. And we'll start going through those as we get them in. We'll be back tomorrow. Have a great day.
The Hagmann Daily Show is brought to you by the Hagmann Report. Tune in to the Hagmann Report weekdays, 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information, go to HagmannReport.com. That's HagmannReport.com.